Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another in our series of webinars sponsored by the Koeze Business Ethics Initiative here at the Seidman College of Business at Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids. My name is Michael DeWilde. I direct the center. I'm also in the management department here. Today, we are joined by Professor Nathan Goetting, constitutional law scholar, professor of criminal justice at Adrian College on the east side of Michigan. Also in the room with me are 10 students from the EMBA class here at Seidman. Today's topic is social media, free speech, the disinformation age. It's got a subtitle, Against Paperless Book Burning and Toward an Emersonian Vision of Radically Free Online Speech. Hopefully we'll unpack what all of that means as we go along. The Emerson that Professor Goetting refers to in the subtitle is probably not the Emerson that you have in mind. He'll explain that as we go. First, I want to welcome everybody in the room as well as Professor Goetting. Thanks for making the trip. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I think one of the first things we want to do is make sure, like good old philosophers that we are, that we're relatively clear about terms. Free speech is probably the one that people think they know the most about and yet may not. Do you want to start just by taking us through free speech from a constitutional point of view?
Well, sure. Speech, as used in the First Amendment, is a legal term of art. It doesn't mean what we colloquially refer to as speech. You know, in the 1948 case, Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire, Justice Murphy, who was a former governor of Michigan, I'm a homer if nothing else. All right, and so Justice Murphy wrote the opinion, and he explained that for constitutional purposes, speech doesn't mean valueless speech. It means speech that's imbued with some modicum of value, some intellectual content, and that there are certain categories of expression that are not going to be protected by the First Amendment. It's like defamation, obscenity, fighting words. So there were a list of categories that were deemed so valueless that they weren't going to receive the benefit of constitutional protection. But the primary reason that these categories would be unprotected is that they were perceived as having little value. And value, I think, can fairly mean, in this opinion, intellectual content, devoid of intellectual content. So if we're speaking of mere name calling, which is what was at issue in that case, there was an angry citizen who called a police officer a fascist and an agent of fascism. A mere name calling, and the court said that that speech is devoid of value such that it should get constitutional protection. So when we say speech in terms of the First Amendment, the court has never embraced the idea that it refers to all human communication, but limits it more to communication with some modicum of value. And if it's all right to clarify our terms a little further, I'd like to describe the values of the First Amendment, and more particularly the benefit we get from allowing a more radical interpretation of the First Amendment and a more permissive society when it comes to free speech. The Emerson, of the title refers to Tom Emerson, who, to my mind, was the greatest First Amendment scholar we've ever had. He was a professor at Yale for 30 years, and in 1963, he wrote an article called Toward a General Theory of the First Amendment. And in that article, he listed 4 premises or purposes. And what they really are benefits that we get from an expansive notion of freedom of speech. Really quickly, here's what they are. And the reason I'm telling you, what they are up front is I anticipate being challenged by questioners who say that there are certain countervailing social interests that are more important than freedom of expression. For instance, anti-racism, public safety, the truth as opposed to the dissemination of lies. I mean, there are powerful countervailing interests that would limit freedom of expression. I get that. They're important. The theory that Emerson gives us, and this is also the theory of certain justices who've served on the Supreme Court, is that these harms that come from freedom of expression, and they're real, freedom of expression hurts people, but these short-term harms are redeemed by long-term gains. The pain we get from letting idiots, jerks, racists, creeps speak, is real, but in the long run, the benefits outweigh them. And here's what those benefits are. First, freedom of expression is essential for individual fulfillment. This is an Aristotelian claim. We realize our potential by being allowed to express ourselves freely. Artists in particular benefit in this way. Bob Dylan can write any song he wants. So can Snoop Dogg, so can Jay-Z. And for a censor to limit the creativity of the artist is an insult to the dignity of the artist. You know, we need freedom of expression to find out where we fit in this world. So poets, other artists, but also all of us should be free to say whatever it is we think are true or is true without the obnoxious interference of the censor. Right. Secondly, the search for truth requires radical freedom of expression. Right. This is a Socratic claim. That is, you know, all of society should be one big Platonic dialogue where people are trying to figure out what's true without any interference from the state, because in order to investigate the human condition meaningfully, so as to arrive most expeditiously at truth, we need to be able to ask challenging questions, you know, without any hindrance or modifiers. Even false or pernicious ideas have value in that they trigger a response. They force us to re-examine basic truths that we've accepted as premises. They stimulate intellectual engagement. Now, I understand that there are certain annoying creeps who are against the discourse, the mere name callers and so on. You know, fortunately, the First Amendment allows us to tune them out. The First Amendment protects us from becoming a captive audience. We can block them on our Facebook pages. We can turn around and walk out if we don't think they're helping in the search for truth. But there's a vast difference between that and state censorship or corporate censorship, which is always an act of power, an act of aggression, and contempt for those, you know, who are speaking. It's always top-down control. You know, the censor is always in a position of power, or he couldn't, you know, effectively censor. So the third benefit that we get from radical freedom of expression is meaningful participation in our democracy. You know, we can't be a self-governing nation if, you know, we can't effectively communicate whatever we want to with our fellow citizens. If we don't have access to information, if the government is shielding us from things other people are saying, particularly about the government, you know, dissidents, you know, who have critiques, even radical critiques, even offensive critiques. You know, we can't understand all that we need to in order to vote, you know, and choose our own government. And remember, they work for us, we don't work for them, all right? We hire and fire them in a democracy. And unless I'm able to know what my fellow citizens think about them without the government modifying their thoughts, I can't meaningfully be in charge, right, as citizens in a democracy should. And lastly, and I think this, you know, fourth premise is getting a lot more currency, particularly since the January 6th riots at the Capitol. The First Amendment serves as a kind of safety valve. It allows for an adaptable, stable society. There are going to be people who are angry and are, you know, guided by dangerous ideas. We have them in our society. We have a lot of them in our society. So what do we do with them? If we criminalize their beliefs, right, we force them underground. They don't go away. They don't all of a sudden become, you know, sympathetic to pluralism. You know, they don't change their views. They become angry, resentful, they submerge. And because they're not allowed to speak freely and openly in our society, their only means of expression is violence. And that's when we get acts of terrorism. That's when we get dangerous clandestine behavior. If we let them speak, they air their dirty laundry for all of us to see. We know who they are. We know what they have to say. We can stigmatize them, shun them, criticize them, and hopefully, you know, their minds might just possibly, some of them, be open to persuasion and we can convert them, right? That's the theory of the First Amendment. Counter speech, you know, in such a way that we can all move toward truth and a more elevated human condition.
That raises a number of questions for me, so let me try to take them one at a time. But first, maybe you can help us understand why this is radical and why you use the term radical in your subtitle.
Right, because it's the First Amendment is perpetually radical. A freedom of expression for those you disagree with is about the most counterintuitive and unnatural thing in the world. If you believe that someone's ideas are harmful, say for instance, I'm a theist, I'm a believer, and I think that atheism is poison to our social bloodstream, right? That attacks the one true loving God, and it's blasphemy. It makes perfect sense for me to want to remove those ideas from society, right? What freedom of expression means is that we tolerate even those ideas that we believe with our heart or with the wholeness of our heart cause harm. That's unnatural. If you think about it, in other contexts, if we find behavior harmful, we ban it. We ban murder, bank robbery, we make it criminal because it has no good use. But the First Amendment is radical in that it's a kind of faith. We let these people speak in ways that we realize cause short-term harms because the long-term benefit outweighs them. That's why it's radical. And one more quick thing. That's why the Supreme Court has to constantly re-educate society about the importance of freedom of expression. That's why these debates we're having are perpetual and they're cyclical. It will always be radical because politicians will always want to censor those who criticize them, and human beings will always want to censor those who disagree with them.
I got it. Thanks. Along those lines, can you say a little bit more, maybe by way of an example, that would help us understand this value, valueless distinction? You mentioned art, and some artists, there's been a history, right, of attempting to censor or ban some art on the grounds that it has no socially redeeming value. But you also seem to be saying that, all right, I get to say anything that I want, whether I'm Bob Dylan or I think you use Snoop Dogg. Is there an instance that you have in mind that would help us understand when that line is crossed and when something becomes valueless, at least in the eyes of the court, and then what the consequences of that would be? Sure.
Well, the two examples that the court has consistently given us of art that transgresses First Amendment boundaries are obscenity and child pornography. So, if a work of art is deemed obscene, then it's rendered unprotected by the First Amendment. And the court has a long history of agonizing over which works of art are obscene. So, famously, James Joyce's Ulysses was deemed obscene and banned. Henry Miller, and then numerous works of pornography that would often sort of straddle the line between criminality and art that courts have had to reckon with. For instance, the 1972 movie Deep Throat, which is one of the most profitable movies of all time, pornographic or mainstream. I think it made $640 million. Right, so there's certainly a public demand to see that work of pornography, but it was pornography and controversial and obscene, and the courts had to reckon with it for a period of years. So if a work of art is patently offensive, meaning it's obviously obnoxious and appeals to a prurient interest. In other words, it tries to make the viewer horny, right? That's what appeals to a prurient interest is, a horniness test. Does the court use that language? It uses the appeals to a prurient interest language. Right. But when I get a quizzical look from students, I say it's a horniness test, right? And by that, I mean, are the artists trying to make the consumers of the art, the reader or the viewer, horny? And then the work of art has to, quote, lack serious value. And the judge gets to decide whether the work of art lacks serious value. So this is hopelessly arbitrary. It's a mess. My perspective on this is let it all be protected rather than a judge work as literary or film critic to determine value as our current system allows. So is that another way that we might interpret your use of radical then, that you don't see a helpful distinction between value and valueless? You'd rather court of public opinion, let the market decide, et cetera? Oh, I can tell for myself what has value and what doesn't. I don't need a government censor to tell me with that, right? The books on my shelf, to date myself, the DVDs in my collection, because I still watch DVDs. I don't need anyone to go through my collection and tell me which ones have value and which ones don't. I can handle that myself in a free society.
That presupposes some level of education. We've long conversations about utilitarianism, a John Stuart Mill perspective, long-term versus a kind of short-term Bentham pure pleasure, right? As you know, Mill would argue for the higher order pleasures. You can only know them if you've experienced both, been educated, been in the company of people who also understand and appreciate those. Do you have any sympathy at all for the professional cultural critics, the people who worry about the state of things, that a preponderance of quote unquote valueless art or entertainment, especially as directed towards the young, compounded by social media algorithms, which are designed to get people addicted to this, undermine the very kinds of distinctions that people you think are otherwise able to make?
No, I don't have much sympathy for that perspective. Now, for one thing, I don't, you mentioned social media algorithms, and this is the new motivation behind the current wave of censorship. The current impetus is that we have this breathtaking new technology that's remolding our society. It's out of control. It's promulgating lies. It's poisoning the public mind. It's turning us against each other. What are we going to do with this disinformation? But this argument that politicians are making and others are making, isn't particularly original, and this isn't a particularly new problem. Every time human beings have developed technology to better their communication with one another, governments and elite members of society, the educated, which you describe, get fearful. What they're fearful of is that their power is going to be taken by those that they govern. So, when the Bible was translated into the vernacular language in the Middle Ages, there was mass censorship by those in charge. When Gutenberg invented the printing press, there were mass efforts at censorship to keep the people from believing the wrong things. What we're seeing is something similar. Social media, the internet is letting us talk to each other, right? And some of us are not believing the right things.
Well, exactly. So let me suggest that maybe, and you're right, it's a lot of serious people, not just politicians, who are concerned about this. And the concern isn't just losing power. The concern is that the mis or disinformation, the outright falsehoods, conspiracies, whatever they might be, have, as you alluded to earlier, consequences that are compounded by the social media echo chambers that are really greater than anything we've seen before. So let me just very quickly, from the New York Times, that bastion of liberalism, this is Robert Frank writing February 11th, 2021, so this year. Careful studies have shown that Facebook's algorithms have increased political polarization significantly. Researchers have identified a small group of right-wing personalities whose influence on social media played an outsized role in promoting false beliefs about the 2020 presidential election, and witness testimony leaves little doubt that posts on a variety of social media platforms helped provoke the January 6th assault on the nation's capital. So let me take it one step further in terms of this sort of professional worry, and that is that you can end up in a situation, the assertion or the argument goes, in which the very democratic norms that you would otherwise champion can be undermined by too great of an exercise or kind of unchecked flow of mis or disinformation in the name of the First Amendment that ends up undermining the very democracies and institutions that would protect those freedoms in the first place, if you follow me.
Yeah, all of which apparently have been exposed in the New York Times, so that I'm now aware of them, and now I can repudiate the wrongdoers and move on with the discourse. The remedy for this pernicious behavior described in the article is counterspeech, is investigation, is learning more, exposing, shaming, understanding. It's not shutting down the speech of those who are lying and disturbing us. It's exposing them so that they can be corrected and that we can better understand what's going on. And that seems to have been what's happened in that case.
The counter argument, I suppose, might go somewhere along the lines of we were perilously close on January 6th to witnessing consequences that would have made it maybe difficult to walk back from that.
Right.
So your principled and admirable view that human beings, Americans in particular, in this case, can take the long view, can study, educate themselves, inform themselves, come to better conclusions about what helps fortify a democracy in our case. That's all something that can happen over time. The argument would be what we're seeing is because of these particular echo chambers, the speed of the internet as opposed to the dissemination of books would be consequences that are too great in real time to overcome that's what evolution of information that corrects for that.
Yeah, and well, first, there's no doubt that freedom of expression creates a certain amount of danger and at times chaos, and certainly conflict. It presupposes conflict, and with conflict, there's risk. When you have free people, who are exchanging ideas about, about concepts and feelings that are, explosive, within politics, there's going to be aptitude for violence. Certainly the framers of the Constitution understood that. And so the First Amendment requires this faith that I mentioned, that all of these dangers, which are very real, and pervasive, are redeemed by the benefits that I mentioned at the beginning. And about the technology, which I understand that you rightfully revert to, because this is the argument, the impetus behind the argument for the new censorship. I immediately recognized the same argument, at least part of it, the same argument that was made when Galileo first looked through a telescope. Oh my goodness, look what he sees. When the world finds out that the earth goes around the sun, right? And now there's a printing press which can spread this. What are we going to do? We have to put Galileo in jail and prohibit him from publishing.
I see where you're going, but let me try it from a slightly different, not slightly, but actually maybe the polar opposite point of view. And that is, and questions were asked by registrants along these lines too. And that is, at least in hindsight, right, we recognize the truth. It's the second benefit that you mentioned, right? The search for the truth. And right? Let's assume Galileo was trying to search for the truth, right? Let's assume that, justices weighing arguments about obscenity or pornography are trying to discern the truth about what has value and what doesn't. The question that gets asked more and more now, because of this polarization, and I'm taking this from Bloomberg and some of the other questions as well as my own, and that is, but what do you do when people are knowingly, willingly, politicians or others on the internet, engaging in falsehoods? In other words, I know this is a lie. I'm doing this, to put it in your terms, to increase my own power, right?
Yeah.
And you will say, okay, well, it's an outright falsehood, it's an outright lie, all of us good, well-intentioned people will in time figure that out, debunk it, and come to, again, this sort of democratic pluralism that we all enjoy. But the question is, shouldn't or couldn't there, does the Supreme Court allow at least for some sanctions if I'm not sort of just on the search for truth and I don't know where it's going to lead, but rather I'm on the search to mislead. I'm on the search to get you to believe something that is not true.
Right. And that's precisely what I recognize whenever I hear a politician speak just about, right? Intentional misrepresentations of truth, and designed to further their own power, right? We're used to this. This is how politicians often speak to us. I get that it's amplified now due to social media and polarization, and there are unique problems that go along with it, but I don't think they require abandoning, these tried and true constitutional understandings of the First Amendment. Now, you'll forgive me. There was a lot in your question, but there was one that I really wanted to respond to, but forgot. There's one I wanted to respond to and forgot, and I think it was the one that you were most emphasizing. Do you mind giving it to me again?
deliberate falsehood. I
Yes.
know that I mean, it's my whole point is to use social media because it's the most widespread form of communication right now to mislead, to get you to believe something that I know is untrue. That is, I think, either going to redound to my benefit or maybe it just gives me some sort of perverse pleasure to do so. Let me read the piece in Bloomberg. So they reference the Alvarez case. Maybe you can help us understand that. And even though the court upheld Alvarez's lies in this case, which you'll give us some background on, the writer goes on to say, the court did not deny and could not deny that plenty of falsehoods can be regulated or forbidden. It's a crime to lie to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It's a crime to impersonate a federal officer. If you sell a useless medicine and falsely say it'll prevent cancer, you can be punished. If you tell the local authorities you saw your neighbor selling heroin when you saw no such thing, you violated the law, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But here's his point in terms of social media and the First Amendment. If journalists write what they know to be false, if the statement or report actually injures somebody, the First Amendment does not stand in the way of civil sanction.
Yeah, the author, has, either a weak or tendentious understanding of these cases, or is simply ignorant about, what the First Amendment allows and protects and what it doesn't. So the Alvarez case that to which you refer is fundamentally different than all of the hypothetical examples that the author gives. So in the Alvarez case, the court dealt with lies per se, not lies that are brigaded with or inherently connected to illegal activity. So what happened with Alvarez was, Mr. Alvarez was a liar about, he claimed to be a Congressional Medal of Honor winner. And I think he even donned medals, fake medals. And he did this to gain currency in his community. Maybe he got dates, I don't know. But, he was, just a liar and a creep, and he was exposed. His lies violated a federal statute called the Stolen Valor Act, which was designed to protect the prestige of particularly Congressional Medal of Honor winners by punishing those who falsely claimed to have won that honor, right, and diluted the prestige by doing so. So with the Alvarez case, what the court was looking at is not lies that are inherently a part of criminal behavior, like fraud, lying so as to get money, or defamation, lies that cause reputational harm to others. I mean, these were lies per se, lies that weren't, brigaded with other forms of illegal conduct. So it's a very different issue. So I think, one of the justices, I think it was Sonia Sotomayor, during oral argument asked Alvarez's attorney, so, I'm paraphrasing. She said something like, your argument is the First Amendment shouldn't protect liars. Well, what if, I'm on a date and the man tells me a lie, so I'll like him more, right? Can that be a crime, right? If we're going to punish mere lies? Something like that. The primary reason punishing mere liars, as opposed to these other kinds of wrongdoers, which most of us are fine with, is in order to enforce it, we're going to have to create a ministry of truth. Right? There's going to have to be a government bureaucracy, in which there'll be badged and armed government agents investigating those who tell lies. How confident are you in your government's ability to do that well without overreaching or being arbitrary? And I encourage all of you to think about this. Can you imagine a much more loathsome character than the government censor, than the person who distinguishes between what's a lie, what's true, what you should be able to read, what you shouldn't, what you should be able to post, what you shouldn't, someone who scrutinizes your writings on social media to determine whether you're violating the narrow contours of the laws that your politicians have authored, right? Who wants that job? And probably not the kind of person you want to hang out with. And who would you put in that position? Who would you trust to do that job when it came to your writing and your reading? Anybody you know smart enough, competent enough, omniscient enough to do that job well? Would you like to do that job? Would you be confident, telling people what they can read, write, say, what's true, what's false? No one can do that job well, because you have to be all-knowing to do it. It's dangerous. And that's why the court ruled properly in the Alvarez case. Freedom of speech requires freedom to breathe while you're speaking. And a ministry of truth is inimical to democracy.
So say a little bit more, then help educate me and help clarify that. When not just this writer, but others asserts that there is precedent in the court to punish, say by prior restraint, certain defamatory or outright falsehoods, what does that mean? In order to protect, because the government does protect us from any, I take your point. I mean, I completely agree. I wouldn't want anybody in that position. And of course, I'm not advocating for it, but I'm just for the sake of clarity, the government does an awful lot, goes out of its way, does give people certification of one kind or another to regulate, to police, oftentimes, right, supposedly in our own best interests, right, to protect us from ourselves, if not from others. I certainly don't want that in the case that you mentioned, the way you set up the Ministry of Truth, of course. But I guess what I'm asking is, given that there is so much government regulation and intervention in terms of what we can and can't do often to protect us from ourselves, is it the case that the court would allow for some kind of sanctions against journalists, politicians, others who engage in outright falsehoods to spread disinformation toward a particular end, perhaps that results in injury that is actionable?
There are some categories of expression that the court will regulate or will allow the regulation of as conduct, not as speech. So defamation is one. So if the lies, injure someone's reputation, then they're actionable. If there's obscenity, child pornography, but mere lies, no, they're not regulable. It's the job of the citizen to be active enough in the pursuit of truth and in the participation of democracy to choose who to trust, who not to trust. And I hope all of us are already doing that. I hope all of you have found sources that you deem unreliable and sources that you deem reliable and that have earned your trust so that you go back to them. And if they fail to maintain your trust, you abandon them. This is our civic duty and our responsibility. If we're going to have a democracy, we have to search for truth and we have to protect it. That's our role as citizens. And so, the court, I think, has done a good job of understanding that democracy requires, citizen participation in that way, such that the press will cultivate readers and viewers based on trust. Now, the problem we have now is a business model within our media that has figured out that it doesn't, that the search for truth isn't always the guiding motivation of its viewers. And this is where we get the echo chamber, right? And so, on both sides, and just to pick two representative examples, Fox News and MSNBC, it's very obvious that their business model involves stoking the energy of those predisposed to agree with whatever ideology they're promoting. So, they figured out how to get endorphins moving in the brains of their viewers, and the objective pursuit of truth and the promotion of a healthy society seems to have taken a secondary role to getting viewers, getting ad revenue, and this is not healthy for our democracy. So, what I personally have done is stopped watching and found other sources that have earned my trust. And I think that's what all citizens should do. Now, I don't mean to denigrate those, who disagree with me and think that Fox News, is promoting truth and helping society, or MSNBC is. I simply disagree with you. I've arrived at a different choice, and I find different sources trustworthy. So what we should do, and what the First Amendment encourages us to do, is talk about it. Figure out why you like MSNBC and I don't, and then we maybe persuade one another.
Do you worry that the business model, as successful as it has been, not just for Fox News or MSNBC, but Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, begins to crowd out alternative, credible voices? So in other words, you're right. There's a duty. It's incumbent upon us to seek out these alternatives to partake, or as you say,
falls on us as citizens to be active and to resist. And personally, that's what I've tried to do by finding, different online sources, that I trust, and I've encouraged others to do so. We all have the ability, at least for now, to participate in our democracy, share our ideas, and to expose exactly what's going on, both on social media and on cable TV, satellite TV, and insist on more democratic, more fair-minded, more open discourse in media. But this I don't want to create the impression that this is a new problem. Again, this is a perpetual problem. It's taken on new form. There are new facts, new technology, new interests, but this is something that we've dealt with as long as there's been human politics. I think it just seems new to us because we're feeling it experientially as opposed to reading about it or studying it.
Well, speaking of situating ourselves historically, I'm going to shift just a little bit. Traditionally, I think it's fair to say that people like us have been gateways to credible information, right? We are supposed to have read widely, broadly, and introduce our students to credible information from a number of points of view. Well, let me ask it as a broad question to start. Right, depending upon the regime, scholars have always been a bit careful, going back to Galileo, about revealing what they know, right? The consequences for that can be severe.
Right.
These days, I think a lot of people would argue the real danger is our own self-censorship in the face of students or a larger public that would find some of what we had to say offensive, and don't believe that they should be offended, that they've got a right not to be offended. In terms of this sort of theme that you brought up, the responsibility is on us to seek out credible information and resist and all that sort of thing. How do you understand the self-censorship of people in our profession? And maybe you can use the Georgetown law as a way into that.
What happened at Georgetown, to the extent I'm familiar with it, was that a couple of part-time faculty members were caught on a sort of hot mic situation. They were in Zoom, and the students, they believed the students couldn't hear, but the students could hear, or it was recorded and they heard later. So they're having a private conversation, or what they thought was a private conversation. And one of them said something about race, something to the effect of, and correct me if I'm wrong, that non-white students weren't performing as well as white students, and this was frustrating or something like that. And then the listener, just sort of nodded and said, as if to say, I understand, neither, affirming or disputing. All right. And, I think the speaker was fired, and then the listener, I may have resigned, was pushed out, but also left mid-class, right? Under, accusations that this was offensive speech. And I think the students, who got wind of it demanded that they be disciplined, something like that. So, this reminds me of a conversation I had with a law school class of mine. We were talking about, I believe it was gay marriage, which was a hot button issue at the time. And a very bright student said to me, well, look, we might as well not discuss it because, we're just going to disagree and it's going to turn combustible. And I said to him with a kind of faux naivete, I said, well, why? Why shouldn't we discuss it? He said, well, people will get offended. And so why? I said, don't you think that precisely because it's so controversial, we have an enhanced duty to discuss it, to reconcile these issues with one another, to figure it out more? And I said, I don't think so. I think it depends on how we discuss it. First, when it comes to students, my experience has been, if the students know that you genuinely care about them and their education, and the reason that you're there is to help them learn, that they tend to be generous when you make mistakes. If it's honest, if you really do have that relationship with them and you've earned their trust, they tend to be generous if you make a mistake. Not that I ever have. But But also, what I said to this student was, look, if we disagree on this, but we're both searching for what's right, and we're both searching for what's true, and we express our disagreements in the spirit of the pursuit of truth, right? Then we have a lot in common. We have something more important in common than our disagreement, and that is we're speaking to each other with open minds, trying to figure out what's right. Socrates famously said to Gorgias, if you want to, I'm paraphrasing here, I don't even speak Greek, but he said, like, if you're here just to win this debate, then I might as well leave, because winning doesn't matter to me. But if you're as willing to be refuted yourself as you are to refute me, well, then we have a conversation worth having. If you're a truth seeker rather than a debate winner, then let's talk. And so I told my student, as long as you're saying something because it genuinely satisfies your intellectual curiosity, you're trying to learn, then it shouldn't be offensive.
The counter to that, very bright, great student in class recently, something along these lines came up, identified as a person of color, said, and we're talking about, otherwise well-intentioned white men, especially losing their jobs, their careers disappearing because they said the wrong thing in some way. Maybe they thought they were acting in the spirit that you outline, but nonetheless, it came across as defamatory or prejudice or offensive or hurtful in some way. And her take was, I think she would agree with you, right? If it was all in that context, that would be fine.
Yeah.
But I think part of her point was, well, look, how many aggressions, how many defamations do I and people like me have to put up with before somebody finally calls BS on these guys, right? If everybody is as well-intentioned as this ideal interlocutor that you're talking about, okay. But since that's not the world we live in, she said, I'm not going to lose any sleep over some of these people losing their careers because, look, the people I come from have lost opportunity and limbs and lives for hundreds of years, being on the wrong side of that search for truth. So maybe she said, maybe the pendulum has swung too far, but I don't regret that at the moment, because maybe that's the wake up call that, quote unquote, people like me really need.
Yeah.
I should be self-censoring maybe more than I do.
Yeah, I understand. And when, that's why I wasn't being flippant when I said that freedom of expression causes real harm, real hurt. And in particular, it hurts those, who are disempowered, and who have been historically. And so it's important to remember that. Freedom of expression, however, has also been a tool for liberation. And, particularly during the civil rights movement. The Warren Court in the 1960s was a great friend to a large extent to Martin Luther King and those in the South. I could list a number of Supreme Court cases. In fact, literally the case that involved Martin Luther King writing his letter from a Birmingham jail. When he was in jail, that case went to the Supreme Court and Martin Luther King's side won. And it was a First Amendment case. Those in the South did not want Martin Luther King to speak. Right? There was an active censorship movement. So, I understand the complexities, or at least I try to. But if you look at the long view about what freedom of expression has done for the disempowered and how necessary it's been for them to get their point of view out and to convert and to build their movements, I have to believe that that progressives should want to preserve that right, because right now, those in power, particularly, since January 20th, are Democrats and anti-Trumpers, and a lot of the things that Trumpists have said have been repulsive and false, and I get the impetus to censor, right? But it's just a matter of time before the shoe's on the other foot. They always switch feet, and if we close the door behind us, that is, if we eliminate First Amendment protections now, when we turn around and we need them as a shield, they'll be gone. Nadine Strawson just wrote a book called Hate, and I'm shamefully stealing her argument here. Is that, liberation movements need freedom of expression. It's just a matter of time.
along those lines, maybe you brought up Trump. Can you say a word about the deplatforming of various speakers? I mean, I think everybody recognizes that private companies, of course, have the right to regulate speech on their own platform, or maybe you disagree with that. Maybe.
Well, I think there are interesting arguments to be made on that. I don't mean to digress. I'm glad to speak on it, but if you have a more particular question.
No, so that's the question. So if I'm reading you correctly, nobody on Twitter, really, no matter their point of view, or even some of the consequences of it, would ever have their Twitter account taken down. I mean, nobody would be shut down from Facebook, right? Am I reading that correctly? That's part of what you mean by the radical free speech?
Yeah. I would have open Twitter. Yeah. I'm what, I believe what in the theory expounded by Jonathan Turley, he refers to them as internet originalists, meaning that the internet is a free forum. We can all say whatever we want without any government or intrusion. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned corporate censorship. Do you want me to pick that up?
Yeah, maybe just for, again, clarification's sake. You said there are interesting arguments on both sides. Maybe you can.
Well, this is called the little brother problem. The big brother problem is government censorship, which the First Amendment expressly contemplates. But then we've got, this little brother problem, which in a lot of ways is just as vexing. So, in a free market society such as ours, corporations have an awful lot of power. They have the power to deprive their workers of their livelihoods. And, when we work for a corporation, we inevitably have to conform to the corporation's rules. We have to wear their uniforms. Sometimes we have to, endure the petty indignities of, going to the bathroom when they give us permission, putting our purses and bags in cubbies. We have to obey these corporate rules. And that means we can't say what we want on corporate time. And if we use corporate products for consumers, they're often terms of use. Well, what we have now is the government pressuring these corporations, that literally calling the CEOs in for interrogation and wagging the moral finger and exhorting them to censor. I think, a compelling argument can be made that this is government censorship by proxy, that, the government isn't censoring, but the government is putting such pressure on corporations to censor that the corporations are effectively agents of the government. And there is at least one really good Supreme Court case sort of explaining that this principle and how this might be a successful argument against what these against the little brother problem or this corporate censorship. The petitioner would have to show that the government is that the corporations are deplatforming or censoring as a result of government pressure. But I think there's evidence of that.
Thanks. We got a question from the audience that's here with us.
Just following up on that last question in that conversation, would you argue then that corporations don't have the right to censor speech of their employees, or is that what you were arguing? No,
they certainly have the right. Under the Constitution does not protect employees from censorship by their employers at the place of employment. The First Amendment only protects against state actions, government actions. Personally, I would love to see, this will never happen, but I would love to see a federal statute, a federal civil rights statute giving employees free speech rights. But right now they don't have First Amendment free speech rights at the workplace. Their employers can tell them what they can and can't say, to a large extent anyway.
Why do you think that the U.S. government or the Constitution hasn't extended the concept of freedom of speech to the workplace?
Well, there's a longstanding Supreme Court precedent which says that the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment, which are the two constitutional amendments that protect free speech, only protects government against government censorship. They were only meant to. And what that means is that, employers can discipline and control their employees' behavior, for the sake of running an efficient business. So if I'm a cashier and I tell my customer that, they look sort of ugly, frankly, and I don't, don't get me wrong, I'll put your money in the register, but, do something with that face. No, I can get fired, right? And any reasonable employer would want to fire me. It'd be bad business. However, that's very different from a city government or a state government passing a law, prohibiting us from calling one another ugly.
But so my question is, or maybe my leap in this is, can't that same principle be used? Employers are doing that to protect their business.
Mm-hmm.
Can't that same leap be made from a civic standpoint, that in fact governments have the responsibility to put in guidelines that protect the society from their citizens just saying whatever?
Yeah.
That it's not okay for me to say as an employee to our customer, you're ugly, your face is ugly, I'm not going to serve you.
Mm-hmm.
To being a citizen, we have a social responsibility to our government to say, to not lie, to not say, we need to everyone grab a gun and go to the Capitol and storm the Capitol. Can't we, isn't that a natural extension?
No, it's a natural desire. It's something that I imagine many people in society want, and many politicians, I know that they do. The problem is, the First Amendment expressly prohibits it. The First Amendment says Congress shall pass no law abridging freedom of speech. So, the framers of the Constitution recognized that there will be, that there are certain to be instances in which governments will want to do that, there'll be a natural impulse to do that. But this particular government is going to be set up in such a way that the government can't. That's the bold experiment of the First Amendment. That's what distinguishes our Constitution from other constitutions around the world. If you look at the other constitutions, there is no kindred provision, at least not meaningfully. There's some lip service and phony nods toward freedom of expression, but they're not meaningfully enforced. The history of the United States, particularly in the 20th century, has been different. That we've taken that First Amendment right very seriously in the federal courts, and particularly the Supreme Court. We're in one of the situations now, they happen every generation or so, in which the First Amendment is being put to the test. But we're different in that regard.
We're joined online with a question having to do with epistemology. So you said earlier, part of it is seeking out credible sources. You probably knew this question was coming if there were a philosopher listening. How do we know what's trustworthy? How do we know? So my guess is, I'm sure you've had plenty of conversations as we've all had, in which even with, let's say, best intentions, seeking the truth, somebody we're engaged with is so, from our point of view, so deeply misinformed by falsehoods. And you try to gently correct, right? Mm-hmm. Well, there are better sources of information on this particular issue. Yeah. And the question is perennial, that. How do we find out whether it's trustworthy or not? Put on your philosopher's hat for that one?
Well, I'm trying, I'm trying to cabin this question so I can meaningfully respond to it, because there's, that's a big one. Reminds me of how much I like philosophy. But not while I'm on the clock. I think the best way I can answer it is by saying that a certain amount of humility and an appreciation for our own ignorance is required. Ultimately, I think perfect knowledge is impossible. The best we can do is strive toward truth. So if we have, say, an intransigent, invincibly ignorant interlocutor, right? Someone who simply won't listen. Maybe we've met one of these people at our own family Thanksgiving dinners. I don't know. So we say we have one of these people. Fortunately, we are able to leave the room, walk out, and find somebody better to talk to, right? Find somebody, somebody with whom we can have a more meaningful, truth-seeking conversation. I get that that's hard if we're talking about people close to us, and we've got to structure our relationships in a way that keep us sane. But when we're talking about the public discourse, we can turn the channel. We can block people from Facebook. There are all sorts of means by which we can exclude distractions and find those with whom we want to communicate. I reemphasize, part of the First Amendment means no captive audience, right? If the audience is captive, we don't have freedom of speech. We have compelled listening, right? So, inherent in all of this is the ability to get up and walk out if you're not learning anything.
So this reminds me of a conversation we had a long time ago. Andrew Sullivan famously wrote a piece encouraging what? Suggesting that hate speech was misguided as a notion. That, again, as you said earlier, you would want the racist, the supremacist, whomever,
I see. Yeah.
to speak as freely, openly, and publicly as possible, so that person can be debunked, shunned, shamed.
Right. You mean
whatever.
anti-hate speech laws are ill-advised.
So that's
right?
where I was going.
Yeah.
Is that a logical conclusion to what I hear you saying? That look, there wouldn't really even be hate speech, or is a
Well, look, this is a troubling one, because we're dealing with speech that I hope all of us would recognize is deeply harmful, and it's painful. There's an understandable immediate psychic reaction on the part of a lot of people when they experience hate speech, and that should be recognized and it should be dealt with. This is true in a number of other categories of speech too, but it's a particularly important social issue we're dealing with now, in a large national reckoning. So what the court has done is announced that it will not protect what are called fighting words. And there's sort of a Venn diagram with fighting words and hate speech. If the hate speech constitutes fighting words, then it's not protected. If the hate speech does not constitute fighting words, it is protected. And so that means we got to know what fighting words are. Fighting words are speech like taunts, name calling, that elicit an immediate psychic reaction and are apt to cause an otherwise normal person to resort to violence. So the idea is that fighting words will cause a breach in the peace, an imminent breach of the peace. So if the hate speech falls into that category, it's not protected. But if you have hate speech, for instance, on the internet or in a newspaper, it's not going to be fighting words, so it is going to be protected. And as awful as that speech may be, and awful as speech that, say, advocates certain forms of perverse sexuality, advocates terrorism, all of these other forms of harmful ideas that I personally would reject. I think the First Amendment and freedom of expression has to allow that poison into our society, if only so we can spit it out forcefully in the face of those who utter it.
Yeah. And your safety valve point is well taken on that score too. Though, let me direct your attention back to the screen. If we allow information without any fact checking to include photos, for example, I take the famous tank man photo of the man standing in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square as a fact, but how will students be able to conduct research in the future of historical events if all known disinformation is allowed without fact checking? So it's a version of the same question, the credibility question. I assume your answer is more credible speech.
Yeah, look, no, that's a great question. And it reminds me of, a difficult issue that I've been researching and that's been troubling me, frankly, and that's the issue of deep fakes and advanced, manipulative photography that creates that puts those whom it depicts in a false light, such that a reasonable observer might honestly believe that the person depicted is engaged in the activity depicted in that same photo. Yeah, tough. And this is a genuine challenge for First Amendment advocates, as is non-consensual pornography. So so I would put these these new categories, including the one the photography that mentioned by the questioner, into this category of first, if we're talking about non-consensual pornography and deep fakes and so on, I would put this into that toxic category of permissible speech, as long as we're not talking about child pornography or obscenity. Well, adult consensual obscenity, I think the court should allow all that stuff in. But as long as we're not talking about one of these prohibited categories, I think we got to put it in this category of the toxic speech that we permit for the long-term benefits. And at the same time, the duty is on the citizens, to find trustworthy sources. That's hard. But the alternative is worse. The alternative is those sources designated trustworthy will be given to us.
Right.
And that to me, isn't consistent with the First Amendment or a healthy democracy.
Thank you. The questions? Yes. Be patient. We have someone approaching the microphone.
Thanks for the lead up. So in the last couple of years, the CEO of YouTube, Susan, I don't remember how to pronounce her last name, has come under scrutiny. Some might say support, that she has begun to develop a team who is reviewing all the videos that come into YouTube. I'm curious to know your thoughts on kind of almost her version of censorship, and the fact that what I hear you saying is, she should be allowed, YouTube should allow all videos in the sense of free speech. But when you're talking about her and her team looking at videos and not putting them up of racism, of anti-Semitism, of abuse,
Right.
I'm curious to know your thoughts on her kind of censorship of that.
Right. Well, I think you can imagine what they are at this point. That I don't support what she's doing. And what she's doing, by the way, this is the executive speak. This is an MBA audience, so you'll appreciate this. It's not censorship. It's, quote, robust content modification. You get that? Right. This is how executives speak, right? A robust content modification. So first, we're dealing with people who, with a straight face, use language like robust content modification. This tells you the kind of people we're talking about, not the kind of people I want to hang out with at the bar. Right. So these are people, she's doing this to promote her business. And this is not civic duty, right? This is, the Google vice president. I think he may be former Google vice president now, Rob Lethern, said, quote, policies can't be afterthought, or content moderation policies can't be afterthoughts anymore for serious businesses. So all of them are going to have teams of censors, and they're going to look at all the content, just as a censor might look at all the books on your shelf, and they're going to take the books off the shelves that they don't trust you to view, all of us to view. They don't think we should be allowed to see it. So I wonder, what kind of person do you think would sit on this censorship review board? Who are these people? They must be pretty smart, right? If they're willing to do that. We know who these people are going to be. They're going to be, consultants, who want to protect the business, who want to make money for YouTube. They're not going to be psychologists or philosophers, theologians, literateurs. They're not going to be experts in content. And even if they were, they forfeit their status as experts if they want to deny citizens, adult citizens, the right to view whatever they want to view. So I couldn't disagree with it more, but at the same time, I don't want to seem insensitive to what they're trying to do. What we should do, if we don't think that this footage, should get a wide audience, is explain and persuade people to reject it. So you're free to look at this garbage if you want. It reminds me of websites that used to post decapitation videos of hostages from Al-Qaeda. So these are online, and they're about the most repugnant thing imaginable. We should be free to watch it. But that doesn't mean I would ever encourage anybody to watch it. I mean, I don't know whether I would or I wouldn't. It's horrible. But I think we should have a right to see what we want to see. And if we disagree with others viewing it, we should encourage them, but not force them against their will not to watch it. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Nathan, I want to thank you for the time. I know there's some unanswered questions. My apologies, Andrew. But last word in 30 seconds or anything you want to say to sum up?
Yeah, I want to express my gratitude to all of you for having me here. I hope it's been worth your time, and I encourage you, to read up and make up your own mind on these issues. One of my concerns, as someone who's recently become middle-aged and is made acutely aware by my own children of what an old fart I am, is that the generation coming after me has a very different relationship with freedom of expression than my generation and the generation before. If you're raised on social media and someone's annoying you, you can block them, you can discard them, throw them down, the internet sinkhole. And why wouldn't you? They're trolls, their speech seems to lack value. Censorship makes an awful lot of sense when you're cleansing your social media site. But I encourage you to try to take the long view and to try to forecast, work out the consequences, the ramifications. When we talk about censorship, it's always the other person who's getting censored. We very rarely imagine someone forcing us to shut up. Right? But the truth is, it goes in cycles depending on who's in power. It's always free speech for me, but not for thee. All right. It's always whose ox is getting gored. And if you oppose freedom of expression, your ox may be the one getting gored in the long run.
Terrific, Nathan. Thanks a lot for coming up. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.